Thank you very much for coming today for the workshop on natural resources in conflict. I'm going to ask our colleague, esteemed colleague, who is the leader of our program of the HESN. She's Senior Advisor and Director of the Science and Technology Bureau and Director of HESN. So, Takora Jones, please.
Good morning. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out for day 2 of what has been an exciting series of conversations around conflict and development. My name, again, is Takora Jones. I am a Senior Advisor and Program Director for the Higher Education Solutions Network, which is housed out of the Office of Science and Technology at USAID. We are so happy that we have had the opportunity to gather together to think about the issues of conflict. The Higher Education Solutions Network as a whole was created as a way for us to find new ways to engage with the academic community who is so passionate about issues of development. The program was started in November of 2012 after having a very long competition process that started in February of last year. And we have 7 development labs, 7 universities and labs who are focused on a wide variety of issues, each related to the innovation ecosystem and creating more knowledge, data, and analysis for international development. One of the things that came out from your conversations yesterday on human and institutional capital is really about youth. And that's one of the things that we're very excited about as it relates to the network, because there are so many students who are so passionate and so engaged in international development that the potential of the students that are related to this network, and I'll go through the universities that are included in it in a moment, is enormous. Out of the 7 institutions, and I'll go west to east as I did yesterday, so University of California, Berkeley, Michigan State University, Texas A&M University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the College of William and Mary, Duke University, and Makerere University in Uganda. Out of those 7 institutions and their respective partners, you have the power to reach potentially 1 million students. And that doesn't even count all of the applicants to this program that people were so interested in engaging in. So we're interested in the work that this organization, this Texas A&M Conflict and Development Center does. We're interested in how it reaches out and connects to a wider variety of organizations and institutions. We're very proud to have it be one of our initial 7 development labs. And out of the conversations that you have today and tomorrow, carrying those forward, we're very interested in how that then reaches out and touches not just USAID as a partner. I'm very glad to have esteemed colleagues from Natural Resources and Management, Cynthia Brady, a colleague from CMM, Joe Hewitt, who moderated our panel yesterday. Aside from just touching us, we want this Conflict and Development Center to reach out and touch the broader development community. I'm actually also really happy that one of our colleagues from one of the other development labs, Sam, over there in the corner, he's from the College of William and Mary, which is focused on data for development and aid data flows for development. We're so happy that we are starting to make the connections and bridge the kinds of connections between these network partners that we thought was possible. So thank you for coming today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the conversations that you will contribute to. Thank you, panelists, for your time and your preparation. And I will turn it back over to the leader of this lab, Ed Price.
Thank you, Takora. I'd like to introduce as well the rest of the USAID team that's so valuable to us for this workshop. Each of the HESN institutions has a core team of 8 officers that oversee their health and progress within the agency, keep us on our toes, and constantly monitor and support and assist in many ways. Michelle Larchevêque is the leader of that. She's just tremendously valuable. Joe Hewitt has been a tremendous guide to us throughout and continues to guide us. Malcolm Phelps, I believe, is not here yet. Malcolm Phelps is very valuable. And as time goes on, there will be other 8 officers who will join in working closely with us. Really appreciate what they do. At Texas A&M, we are 3 organizations within the university that are cooperating in this. They are the School of Rural Public Health. Rasul Ramji represents the School of Rural Public Health. The Bush School, today we have a speaker from the Bush School, but also we have the students from the capstone course who are dedicated in their final semester to looking at conflict and development. I'd like for those who are in the room to please stand. From the Bush School, these are graduating master's degree holders in School of Government and Public Service. They would be happy to talk to you about careers, or your career, if not theirs. But they're really very fine and wonderful cooperators and supporters of what we do. Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I wanted to introduce my team at Texas A&M, the ones who are closest to us in carrying out this work. Megan Kinney is here, okay. Caitlin Shaw and Vince Partita have been very, very active in the putting on this workshop. Jerry Kinney, very valuable in all that we do. Sharia Kabria, Assistant Director. Megan Kinney, that makes up for yesterday. Yes, and Joey King. I don't believe, I think Joey's working on some other topics right now. The purpose of the Conflict and Development Program is to work with the U.S. Agency for International Development as well as donors more broadly in helping to improve programs and policies as they impact on conflict, reducing conflict, sustaining communities to survive conflict, and then to recover from conflict. Today we're looking at a set of features or factors associated with conflict, natural resources. And this is a panel who will be working with us on that. Then we'll have a response panel afterward. And with that, I would like to ask Cynthia Brady, the Senior Conflict Advisor with USAID's Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, Humanitarian Assistance, and the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank you. So, good morning to everyone. As Ed said, I'm with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, and among other things, I have responsibility for the Environment, Natural Resources, and Conflict portfolio, which is why I was selected to be with this panel today. However, I have the easy job of being a moderator, and all of the great thinkers to my left will be having the heavy lift of putting their good ideas on the table for us to at least begin with as a point of departure for the conversation. I first wanted to, pick up on what Ed was talking about in terms of reminding us about the purpose of today. It really is to generate as many good ideas as possible so that the Texas A&M team can work through those to help focus and prioritize their research agenda for the coming few years. So please today, as you think about the presentations that you're going to hear, also be thinking about where you believe there are the most important either global or USAID knowledge gaps and where the strongest need for applied research lies. A&M really wants to hear your ideas, so use the panelists to generate your own ideas and to sort of inspire the conversation. The panelists were each asked to prepare a framing paper which responded to the following core question. What specific investment or intervention should the development community prioritize to prevent the outbreak of civil violence, support households and communities during conflict, and/or accelerate post-conflict recovery? They were also asked to say the why, the what, and the how behind their proposals. So the format of this morning is going to be first presentations by the three panelists, and then we'll open it up to a broader discussion where we can hopefully maybe add on to and further discuss, elaborate, ask for clarifications on the ideas that were presented. Use that opportunity to think beyond what's been presented as well. After this panel, we will have a break and then we'll reconvene with a second panel of respondents who will be responding to what they've heard this morning and hopefully putting some additional ideas on the table as well. And from there, please just bear in mind, we want to get as many ideas on the table as possible. So everybody is welcome to participate in that conversation. And to lead us off, we will have Bruce McCarl. Maybe I'll just give very brief introduction for the three before we jump into it. Bruce is the Regents Professor and University Distinguished Professor at Texas A&M University. He was also on the Nobel Peace Prize, he was a Nobel Peace Prize participant as a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And Dr. McCarl's recent research efforts have focused largely on policy analysis as well as proper application of quantitative methods. And then second, we will have Jill Urban-Carr. She is the Executive Vice President of Stewart Global Solutions. She has 15 years of experience in land registration, cadastre, and real estate market modernization in both the public and private business sectors. And we will round out the panel with Chad Deere, who is a senior research scientist at the Mountain Societies Research Center, which is housed at the University of Central Asia. He leads the MSRC research teams on sustainable land management and mountain tourism and sustainability. He also focuses on the nexus of rural development and conservation, and he particularly focuses on work in and around protected areas. So with that, I'd like to ask Dr. McCarl to lead us off with his presentation.
All right. As a college professor, I'm slightly PowerPoint deprived, so I put the pictures in the document. So you might want to pull the document out of your portfolio, and I can at least refer to them and pretend I have a pointer and lots of other things like that. At the end of the presentation, I'm basically going to argue that addressing climate change, both information gathering, actions to adapt, and some mitigation is a reasonable thing to consider in a conflict strategy. I also should admit that I'm relatively naive about conflict. I know a lot about climate change and a lot about agriculture, and you'll probably see me reveal that relatively quickly. So the IPCC 10 years ago started doing something I think was quite valuable, which is it started documenting what has been happening as opposed to relying exclusively on projections. So when we look at the evidence, you'll see a picture there in the upper right-hand corner of the document that shows that the Earth has been warming. The last 25 years, we've been warming at a rate about 5 times what we did the last 100 years. That rate of warming is accelerating substantially. Of the dozen or so warmest years we've ever seen, every one of them is since the late 1990s, and just about all of them have a 2000 in front of them. So we're showing an unprecedented amount of warming. This is also changing precipitation patterns. I don't have a picture here, but somewhere around 1990, the global amount of land under drought went from about a 15% pre-1990 average to a 30% post-1990 average. So substantial pressure. And I heard somebody yesterday, I was testifying in Austin yesterday, talk about how drought has directly led to some conflict in Somalia. Well, if we've doubled the amount of land under drought, we've doubled that stressor. The climate is becoming more variable. In northern Minnesota, I think they've had 3 or 4 200-year floods in the last 10 years. That's supposed to happen once every 200 years, and the statistical probability of that happening is pretty darn low. Extreme events are becoming more costly. This little picture in the lower right-hand side that I have is from the SREX report, the Special Report on Extreme Events, and it shows the costs of disasters, and you can see it's rising quite rapidly, especially in Asia. Crops are adapting. We're growing crops further north. Sea level is rising. Collectively, all these things are at least partially caused by climate change. The IPCC says 90+% probability. So if we turn to the next page, this has some developments and some impacts on things that might well drive conflict. Less hospitable living conditions in areas where it's warmer and more variable. Reduced food security, particularly in some subtropical areas. Increased variability in food. Some dislocation of populations due to extreme events and sea level rise. I'll say that in a second. Increases in health risks. We're detecting increased incidence of disease as the climate warms in some areas that didn't have it before. Greater incidence of costly disasters and increased competition for water, with some regions having less available. Globally, we're having more rainfall because more evaporation off the ocean, but the real question is a distribution one. Now, there's not clear evidence on a tie between conflict and climate change. And some say the climate change may contribute to conflict. That was certainly part of the statement of the Nobel thing when Al Gore and 5,000 others of us were somehow included in a sweeping statement. Obama said this. There's lots of arguments that that might happen. When people do statistical analyses, they find insignificant effects, undetectable or small. So it's difficult, and I'm sure that you all are well aware that conflict's complex, and climate is one of a big puddle of things that could be in there. We also see some evidence of climate change causing conflict reductions. You know, if you have higher incidence of extremes, there are people that have found that there's less conflict afterward because people are worrying about other things. Now, these findings may be in part because we haven't seen that much climate change to date. If you look at the picture on the lower left of the lower right of the second page, up till 2000, there's a black line, and it shows around a degree of warming in the Celsius scale. The red line that sort of heads off up above is unabated climate change, and basically, if we followed that red line, we'd have about 4 to 5 times as much as we've had so far. Much bigger stressor, likely bigger effects. On the next page, I talk a little bit about climate change policy. Basically, when we think about the climate change issue, there's 3 big things we can do. The IPCC emphasizes 2 of them. They have a book on effects and adaptation, where the adaptation part is how do we live in a warmer climate, how do we manipulate agricultural and other systems. They have a book on mitigation, which I call here reducing drivers, which is lowering greenhouse gas emissions, but also could include lowering population as a stressor on the climate, lowering water demand, and other things just other than greenhouse gas. And then the third one is what the IPCC is all about, but they never talk about it, which is monitoring, gathering information. What's happening out there? Can we figure that out? This diagram in the middle, this big funny-looking triangle, is from the last IPCC report, and it basically argues we're going to meet in the middle of all of that. We're not going to emphasize any one of those. And in fact, I'll argue in a second, on the developing country side, we really probably ought to specialize more in adaptation than in mitigation. So let me just talk a little bit about these 3, and then I'm probably close to the end of my time anyhow. The first one is investing in learning. In other words, let's learn what's going on. Let's monitor. Let's see what's happening. I have a little picture off to the side here that shows the kind of profound things that could happen, and we need to see as they're emerging. The bottom right there has a picture of Bangladesh area under sea level rise of 1.5 meters. Up in the top left-hand corner of that, you can see Bangladesh as it now is. The bottom, that dark blue area, it would better be known as ocean bottom property under this particular scenario. Well, Bangladesh, I believe, is a country with conflict. If that's dislocating a lot of food and a lot of people, and certainly could be a conflict driver. And we just need to keep up with that to know what's happening, to monitor what's happening with lots of things: disease incidents, pests, warming temperatures, rainfall, etc. So we have a little bit of idea of what we need to adapt to and what the benefits are to mitigation. On the adaptation side, there's a lot of actions that could be undertaken to live better with climate change. Research and development on crops and livestock that perform better under hotter, drier conditions is one area of endeavor. Also, extension, dissemination of information on alternative crops and practices. in many countries, the way farming is done is passed down through the generations. Now, all of a sudden, if you get into an area where the traditional crop is no longer satisfactory, you need some other flow in of information to look at that. And if you look out there on the right-hand side, we did a study a number of years ago in Mali of what the effect was of climate change. Without any climate change, we had 34% of the population at risk of hunger. With climate change but no adaptation, that doubled. And with adaptation measures like better varieties and shift in crop mixes, we were able to bring it back down to about current levels. So there are important investment strategies that would be needed. Finally, on the mitigation side, the picture in the bottom right shows per capita emission rates by country. The U.S. naturally wins in this one, where the orange over there on the left-hand side. But Africa, for example, is the purple on the far right-hand side of the diagram. There's two things to learn from this. The green dotted line is where we need to go to stabilize the climate. That means that Africa can't come up to the U.S. levels, but rather the U.S. has to drop to the African levels, and we have to accommodate development at the same time as having relatively low emission rates. This is why we really worry about decarbonized energy, because in the picture on the other side, 55% of our emissions are coming from energy. But what this also says to me is that changing dramatically the emission rates in the developing countries is probably not that big of a priority. We really need to get those emission rates down in the emerging, what we call the BRIC countries, and in the U.S. and in places like that, accepting perhaps the deforestation issue, which is 17% of global emissions via the last IPCC report. There, I think there's an incentive for how we might manage those emissions. But in terms of development, I think the issue is in the way forward as we add infrastructure, as we develop, as we use more energy, how can we do that in a more emissions-friendly fashion? Then finally, I just want to argue a little bit that all these things are complementary. We did a study on the optimum share of mitigation and adaptation, and that's that diagram that's there. And the only thing I want to point out is notice that right about now, this thing says the optimum share is 90% adaptation, 10% mitigation. Mitigation meaning greenhouse gas reductions. Over time, as the damages get bigger, the share to mitigation gets bigger, because the returns are higher. But still, it really says adaptation may be a priority. Also, we clearly have to recognize that if we start spending money on these things, then we take money away from our ability to invest otherwise in productive capacity, in current consumption, humanitarian aid, other forms of investment, et cetera. So I think it's worthwhile saying climate change could be one driver for conflict. And today, I think we really didn't monitor it so we understand what's going on, adapt, because I think there's a big inevitability to climate change, and begin to design systems as we develop that don't emit a lot more greenhouse gases. So with that.
Thank you, Dr. McCarl. So as our jumping off point, we have climate change on the table. Now we will turn it over to Jill Urban-Carr to put land issues on the table for us.
Good morning, everyone. Good to be here today. I want to talk about land rights and the issues that go along with that in a conflict and post-conflict scenario, or even a pre-conflict scenario. I've got 4 points that I want to get across to you today for consideration. The first is that land is the underlying issue, or it's the underlying support for conflict and post-conflict. It can be the source of conflict, or it can be a solution to resolve conflict. Land issues, or land itself, is a very cross-cutting component to many issues. We could look at it from a perspective of gender rights. We can look at it to Bruce's point, to climate change. We can look at land from a natural resource perspective. We can look at it from a food security perspective. But at the end of the day, the bottom foundation of all of those things is land and the rights that go with that. The third thing I want to just touch on very briefly is the use of technology and how appropriate that is in a conflict, post-conflict land scenario. And then lastly, I put a thought out there for you about perhaps a new model for us to consider when we go into these countries to solve the conflict environment or the post-conflict scenarios. So there's no shortage, I think, of land-related disputes that we can point to, and or the issues that come with land after a dispute. I mean, we can look at Kosovo as an example. People left the country, they've come back to find others living in their homes or using their farmland, and that's a contentious issue still today. The land registration documents were taken from Kosovo over to Serbia, as you know, and they are just now negotiating getting those land records back. So to prove that somebody owns a piece of property is very, very important, again, from a recovery perspective as well as a security perspective. Lots of scenarios from the Romania, Bulgaria, or any of the countries that were following the fall of the Russian control. There's still a serious backlog of land restitution, land dispute cases in the courts that have been there for 20 years trying to do restitution to the properties in those countries. So it's not an easy solution, but it's a definite distinctive component to a lot of disputes, whether it's intended to be the cause of the event that occurred or it's a result of a conflict. Just a couple of comments. Secure land rights have been shown to be a very positive factor in issues related to gender, social exclusion of vulnerable groups, and from a wider social and economic perspective as it pertains to insecure land rights. So the more secure the land rights, the more positive a lot of the other activities are in the society or in the economy. Just to give you some perspective, it's estimated that there are 6 billion land parcels in the world. 1.5 billion of those are registered. In other words, they have a property title. They have some proof of ownership or ownership rights. And those are in the 50 developing countries. That means there's about 4.5 billion land parcels that are in an informal system that have no foundation or security as to the rights that are have been allocated to those properties. That is an indicator of a potentially significant vulnerability regardless of the location. So just to give you a little background on that. Over the course of the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge investment that has taken place, from different entities, USAID being one of them, where it was thought that to go into a country and create a formal land title registration system was the answer. Let's get all the properties surveyed. Let's create a land record archive system so that people can, have security on their land rights. And there was, numerous projects that were done around the world under this approach. Unfortunately, as we all learn as we go, that has been determined to perhaps not be the best approach. I think it was in 2006, the UN Habitat came out with what they call the continuum of land rights. And it identifies, if you will, the possibilities of land rights from an informal component to a formal component, or a customary tenure system to a statutory tenure system. And there's a range of, or degrees even, of activities that can take place along that continuum for land rights. And so that doesn't mean that a formal land title registration system is not part of the answer, because indeed that is more than likely a component, but we can't assume that the customary rights that are in existence and have proven to be reliable in perhaps more remote areas are not also part of that solution. And so to look at land rights as a very holistic component is very important, and not to assume that a customary system is less secure or less viable than a formal land title registration system. So that's the good news, that I guess there's been an awareness and a shift in the approach to going in and securing these land rights. What's really, really important for land rights in general is that there has to be a very comprehensive look at the reform activity. So yes, at the national level, there may need to be legal and regulatory modifications. There indeed may need to be a national land title registration system, but there also needs to be empowerment at the local level and an education of the public, because more often than not, people are unaware of the fact that their land rights may or may not be in the most secure position. So I guess in reading, a lot of the activity that's gone on in recent times, what we've learned is the wrong question to ask when you're out in the field is who owns this land? Because oftentimes, who owns the land? It might be the state. And if you make the assumption that the state is the owner and you go forward with a natural resources project, or you go forward with, a community rebuilding project, assuming that the state is the only actor on the land, you're creating an opportunity for additional conflict. Because there is typically, we see a strata of rights that are associated with a piece of property. Indeed, the owner is one component, but someone may have access rights. In other words, it might be a herder who has been granted rights to the water on a particular seasonal cycle. It might be a farmer who's been granted use rights for planting. It could be a lease from a natural resources extraction component. So this could all be involving the same piece of land, and they could all be overlapping rights. And to be aware of the impact of those interacting rights is very, very important, regardless of the project. I think that's being undertaken. So I wanted to put that in front of you as the issue of land rights is a vulnerability that kind of is a very cross-cutting component that needs to be considered in all of the projects. For consideration, what I had put in my framing paper was 2 locations that I thought would be worthy of additional research and activity. And the first is Burma, Myanmar. They've done a lot in recent years as far as moving forward in their laws, especially looking at it from the land perspective. They've got some new agricultural laws that have come out, and they've reintroduced the concept of private land ownership. So there's an opening, there's an improvement, and there's an awareness that's taking place. I think everyone's very much aware of the geopolitical significance of Burma and Myanmar with their natural resources, with their access to the Bay of Bengal, a lot of potential for that country. Land prices in general have skyrocketed. There's primarily being driven by large agribusiness activity, as well as the natural resource extraction work. So there's an opportunity for some improved processes as it pertains to securing land rights, but there's also a definite probability of conflict arising because of these new actors coming in, whether they're internal or external, in other words, international groups or other countries who are coming in to exploit the opportunities. And the government, their ability to keep up and maintain the knowledge base of who has what rights to each piece of property, I think is a very important component. So Burma is well placed. They've got some initial steps of improvement, and I think with some additional support and certainly no shortage of topics of research there, keeping in mind the land issue as a foundation would be a very interesting component for study. Kyrgyzstan is my other thought. They have made very good steps towards a market-oriented economy in recent years. There's been quite a lot of positive work from USAID and the UN on gender-related issues in land rights, as well as justice component to land rights as well. the thing with Kyrgyzstan, as we know, they're landlocked and they have no shortage of border issues. They have no shortage of natural resource issues because they don't have very many. But there's other opportunities there, and I guess my thought was we should perhaps look at them to keep them from slipping backwards. How can we come in and do some interventions there? Again, looking at the land issues because they are very much a very strong component of the environment. And not to necessarily shore them up, but to help them remain stable. So I put those on the table for places, And so what kind of interventions should we look at? Well, as you can tell, I'm a firm believer that land rights and the issues associated with that should be the foundational factor regardless of the project. So as I mentioned, if we're looking at climate change or we're looking at natural resource management or we're looking at food security, at the end of the day, or at the beginning of the day perhaps, the land is the issue, and that is a key component to the solution. So I would like to submit that all interventions should include a land component. Technology is changing, and I wanted to touch on that just to introduce it, because we haven't actually talked about that very much. But there are a lot of opportunities to collect data very quickly, to take that information and build it into a reliable archive and repository and access point for these countries. And I think what a lot of times has happened is very old tech has gone in as solutions, but it's not necessary to give old technology. Most of the places where we've been, people are able to embrace the new technology, whether it's a handheld GPS or it's use of aerial photography or, Trimble, I know, has just come out with a little unmanned airplane that's capable of doing land surveys and, visual images and it's really great for visuals of a village and for their crops and different activities. And then people get excited because they see their property and it helps them delineate, boundaries, and they all get agreement. Obviously there's a lot of IT technology that could be used on a broader scale as well. Just as an example, in Burkina Faso, we designed the land information system, and the key component for that was how do we have a central IT solution in Ouagadougou, but we've got all these mayors' villages that still have a role to play in the processing of land rights. And so we were able to come up with, a solution that had an IT center, that had a distributed cloud environment to the regional offices. And then for the mayors, because there was good cell coverage, we were able to have the little cell phone modems on a ruggedized laptop, because they don't have a lot of transactions. They have 2 or 3 a week, and they can transmit those as the system's online. So there are ways to incorporate technology as it pertains to land rights and to these different scenarios, and I would encourage that to also be a component of the interventions. And then lastly, as far as interventions go, I took to heart yesterday the comment that a couple of the speakers made where, given the tightening of budgets, that perhaps the days of the big USAID contracts going to the private sector, they may be, in their waning years or something. And that's okay. I think that whether that is or is not the case, I think there's an opportunity, given this environment that we've got in this room, for a public-private partnership approach to these projects. And that would include USAID, and that would include Texas A&M, and that would include the private sector, whether it's a U.S. entity or a local or a combination. But instead of looking at it as here's an opportunity to help a country, and here's a donation of the money from aid or from A&M, why not bring the private sector into that solution and create an environment where everybody has a little skin in the game, as we like to say, and come up with more of a business approach to these solutions, leveraging everyone's capabilities and their knowledge base, and really bring together a very robust, sustainable environment. So I put that on the floor for discussion as well. And in conclusion, I just there's USAID has a very significant IQC that's out called the STAR IQC, and it's the Strengthening Tenure and Resource Rights, I believe is the acronym. But I just want to read from that. There were 10 things that they linked to land issues, and I think it's important to remember that land is not a silo of activity. It's not, here's somebody's property rights, here's their access rights, et cetera. Let's look at it from, I think, way AID stated it, which was very, very clear and very concise. Secure access to land and control of land and land-based resources for all private and corporate citizens is critical to supporting many of AID's strategic objectives, including economic growth, gender equality, women's economic empowerment, food and energy security, nutrition, democracy and governance, conflict mitigation, adaptation and mitigation of climate change, global health, and natural resource management. And I think that cuts across all of the topics that are going to be discussed this week. And again, it reasserts the importance of land rights and the issues around land as we go in and look at these interventions. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Jill. So I think that Chad ended up in a particularly perfect position of being third because he's going to talk to us about the subnational level, looking at communities in primarily mountainous, remote areas of Central Asia who are probably heavily affected by both climate change as well as insecure land tenure and property rights issues. So Chad, take it away.
Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, Ed, and others for organizing and inviting me and allowing me the opportunity to contribute. There are some significant overlaps even between the sessions yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And I think what you'll find is that what I'm presenting really is a strong overlap between yesterday's session on human and institutional capacity and today's session on natural resources. And as Cynthia mentioned, I'm quite happy to be following Bruce and Jill because I'll also be speaking directly to the importance of adaptive capacity and the role of learning as Bruce was mentioning, and also a bit about the centrality of land and even a geographic overlap with Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia that Jill had mentioned. So what I want to do is start off with some of the underlying assumptions that are informing the intervention that we're proposing. And then I want to try and directly address the challenge that Joe and others put forward in terms of presenting a specific intervention. So I'll present that intervention and then a geographic focus for that. And then I'll try and unpack the rest of it in the rest of the presentation. So some of these assumptions that we're taking into it is that the capacity to reduce or prevent local scale, and for the most part I am going to be talking about the subnational scale, provincial down to the village level, but this is also relevant at other scales, at higher scales. But the capacity to reduce or prevent local scale natural resource-based conflicts depends in part, and no magic bullet here, but depends in part on the capacity for local participatory governance. And this capacity for local participatory governance is enhanced if these local systems, and specifically the people who are operating in these systems, have an enhanced capacity to learn about these complex socio-ecological systems of which they are a part, and to integrate this learning into local decision-making. Now, this learning is going to be more relevant and more effective if it includes multiple types of actors and multiple ways of knowing, including local and indigenous knowledge as well as scientific knowledge. And so based on these assumptions, the particular intervention that we're proposing is enhancing this capacity for multi-actor learning and then integrating this learning into local decision-making processes. And by multi-actor, what I mean is the land managers, is other subnational decision makers, as well as the land users, and those groups often overlap each other. But land users, especially those who may be experiencing or experiencing real or potential conflict, But there's a third group, a very important group that I also want to mention, is the critical role of researchers. And I'm not talking about some of us who are in the room, but I'm talking about researchers from these fragile and conflict-affected states, local researchers. And so the geographic focus, what we are suggesting is focusing on these remote, mountainous, poor, and conflict-affected areas in Central Asia, specifically in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Now, these areas, and maybe even more specifically, southern Kyrgyzstan and Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast of Tajikistan, have historically historically experienced violence and continued insecurity. And Jill touched on a little bit of this, but just as a kind of a quick recap for much that we all probably know, there's significant interethnic conflict between Kyrgyz and Uzbek groups in southern Kyrgyzstan, leading to in a flash of violence over 5 days, leading to hundreds of thousands displaced and hundreds dead. 2 revolutions just in the past 8 years in Kyrgyzstan and threats of another. There was actually warnings today of a fairly significantly sized protest in Alato Square in central Bishkek. There's lingering regional divisions from the civil war in Tajikistan and sometimes overt conflict between the central government and opposition figures. As Mark mentioned yesterday, a fairly significant military incursion into the capital of Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast this past summer, and another flash of violence, leaving 20 dead in a day and people very unprepared, unexpected, unable to deal with this. And some of the associated violence with cross-border drug smuggling and other mafioso-related activities, and then the big elephant in the room that that I'll point to is the looming international drawdown in Afghanistan and those spillover effects into Central Asia and the uncertainty and insecurity relating to that. So while there are a few large-scale conflicts, similar to some of the places that we've been talking about, especially yesterday, in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the situation can certainly be described as a negative peace. These are fragile states, and these are places where the emphasis would be on preventing future conflict and as well recovering from some of these conflicts that I just mentioned. But what I really want to focus on is that underlying these occasional flashes of violence and large-scale conflict is the insecurity related to the cumulative stress and competition of the small-scale conflict over scarce natural resources, especially land and water. And in particular, I'm thinking about pasture access and use and water for irrigation from the very small-scale level up to the larger scales. Now, the capacity of land users, land managers to address these smaller scale cumulative stressors of natural resource-based conflict is quite low, especially when it comes to inter-village conflicts. And trust or faith in government institutions, formal institutions, to deal with such issues is largely absent. And so part of the intervention that we're proposing is bringing together conflicting groups together to participate in a purposeful and productive interaction in a safe space. Now, many of you in the room are probably nodding your heads because this is not something that's necessarily new, but it's very much in line with a tradition of peace-building activities along the lines of the people-to-people approach. Now, what is innovative about the proposed intervention is that this purposeful and productive interactive activity focus on learning, as Bruce was mentioning, and integrating this learning into decision making. Now, this I think we talked about adaptiveness. This is kind of the heart of adaptive capacity, is learning and using that learning for decision making. Now, The proposed theory of change, I mean, you can have a look in the framing paper in your folders, and I'd be happy to outline that a little more specifically in the Q&A if you'd like. But what I want to emphasize is another aspect of this, and what may be considered another innovative aspect and that's about who would be involved. So again, we're mentioning land users, we're mentioning other decision makers at these various scales, but what I want to emphasize is the role of research and the role of researchers. Now, an operational aim of this workshop and the larger initiative, I believe, is trying to understand what is the role for research in informing or understanding development and peace building. And I think we'd all agree that this role of research is not something that's a one-off activity, but that research should be an integral and iterative part of development and peace building. Now, I think we'd all also agree that we want this development and peace building to be sustainable and locally owned. And the logical extension and what I'm arguing is that this research to inform development and peace building also be sustainable and locally owned. And so in some ways, what I'm proposing is that some of us as international researchers from the US and other developed countries at least make an effort to work ourselves out of a job. So maybe I'll skip a bit and come to a conclusion, but at one level, what I'm proposing is that research focus on how do we actually go about doing this? So how can these multiple actors, including researchers and land users, land managers, decision makers, collaboratively learn, and how can this learning be integrated into local decision-making systems? And this research has a very applied output, which is the design and implementation of a process to actually do this. This is like really research and intervention intermingling here. But the second level of research is investigating some of the assumptions in the theory of change, and specifically, does this enhanced capacity for multi-actor learning and integration of this learning into adaptive decision-making processes actually prevent or reduce natural resource-based conflict? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chad. That was a perfect presentation to sum up the three, I think. Yeah. So the three speakers have all given us a lot to think about, from the global down to the very local, and I think from the more conceptual down to the very practical, how do we design programs and implement them? So I would like to give the audience an opportunity to respond directly to the ideas that have been presented and to maybe further ask for clarifications or even specific elaborations on some of the ideas that the speakers had. Who would like to lead us off? Tim, please. Do we have a microphone? Sorry, if I could just take one step back, remind everybody that this day is being webcast. So we're going to ask you to use a microphone so that those watching online can see you. And if you could also introduce yourself for the benefit of the audience.
Good morning. I'm Tim Resch. I'm the Bureau Environmental Advisor for the Africa Bureau of USAID, and I've spent most of my career in Africa, but for circa 5 years in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And so while I have a bundle of questions to better understand these three approaches, I have another good idea, and so can I give that now, or should I? Okay, so
Ed is nodding yes, he's in charge.
Okay, the bullet is, and I won't take 15 minutes, but I'll do it in 2 minutes, is extractive industries. Both within USAID, we look at renewable and non-renewable natural extractive industries, natural resources, and so things like timber, other forest products, and fisheries, both marine and freshwater. And then on the non-renewable natural resources, oil and gas and minerals are kind of the suite of of extractive industries we look at. And then another subset of that is industrial large scale, and the other part of that is small scale, artisanal, in all of those four classes, which managed well is a significant factor in economic growth. South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, God willing, Uganda and Ghana on the and Mozambique on newly identified oil reserves, and thinking through how those are going to be managed for the benefit of the respective nations. Mismanaged, we have plenty of examples from blood diamonds, blood timber, conflict minerals, which are a significant driver and destabilizer of countries, and resulting in large numbers of deaths, and for which Eastern DRC is our poster child du jour. But we saw similar things in Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, and other places. So I would also like to table for Texas A&M consideration how the million participants can better influence in Africa as well as other parts of the world, how AID can assist countries in those in that matrix, and whether it's free, prior, and informed consent and social responsibility and large-scale extractive, or managing artisanal industries.
Thank you, Tim. Please, in the back on the left.
John Becker with USAID, help the Board for Food and International Ag Development. Question regarding climate change and land. Land is a sort of a spatial concept, and as we look to the future and carbon accounting, to what extent should we actually be looking at taking apart or disaggregating space to carbon rights, water rights, and actually getting the technology allows us to do that? To what extent do we want to take the land issue apart, looking to the future and some of the attendant issues with climate change implications, adaptation, and look at the potential to focus on conflict or prevention of conflict if we can head off some of those issues?
Thank you. There.
First, I spend an awful lot of time looking at carbon sequestration issues, principally in the U.S. for farms, and eventually sort of gave it up, mainly because if you change practices in farming, the carbon accumulates for about 20 years and then it stops, and you can't change the practice back, so it sort of becomes a permanent lien on the property that you have to follow. And the other thing that I figured out is if you were in a small system with, say, a hectare of land on average by a bunch of people, each person might have 1/4 of a ton of carbon on average to sell a year. And by the time you aggregate that up to the size of somebody wanting to buy carbon, it takes thousands and thousands of people. And the money passing from a major power plant to a small holder, I think there'd be some pretty sticky fingers in between, and not much money would get down there. So I have become much less of an advocate of carbon rights and land lately than I used to be. On the other hand, I really think some of the land rights stuff and carbon and conflicts between traditional grazing uses and seasonality, where you've got people who go out into the areas in the wet season and graze, and then when the dry season comes, they like to come back to these river valleys, and there are farmers that have landed in there and are growing rice, and you have a big mess going on. I think there's one of those in the Niger River in Mali, and I think there's something like that going on in Ghana, or at least Fred Boadu tells me, I don't know. So I think there's some real issues there in terms of land monitoring and who has some seasonal rights to the land and that sort of thing. So with that, I'll let you take the next part.
Thanks. Land is really, it's an asset and it should be treated as an asset. But you have to have an inventory of your assets before you even have an idea as to what the value of that component is. I can't speak to any aspects of the climate component directly, but the complication is the overlapping and overlayered rights to that land, and that's a very tricky issue. I mean, it's very easy to go in and identify a general boundary for a piece of property, but as Bruce pointed out, when you've got transient use rights, if you on a piece of property, and you've got seasonal use rights, and in some cases, where we've had conflict in a neighboring country, those people are coming over and are classified in some countries as squatters on the property. So the dynamic that has to be taken into account for preparing that land foundation is quite complex, and I don't know how to, say this is the right answer so we can potentially head off conflict, but knowing what your assets are and at least beginning to identify that foundation of rights is a starting point. Because otherwise, when you don't have a clue as to who are the actors on that property, it's very hard to anticipate what that conflict scenario might be. Does that answer your question?
Getting at it, I mean, it's time and space is the issue, and you've got transition conflict going out of that. And the question is, to what extent can you take the generic land and disaggregate and really begin to focus your research and your conflict linkages that potentially may be getting worse and head them off through participatory programming, I guess. And if we can inventory those assets and really focus a bit more rather than the generic land.
Well, and I think the key word that you've used and that Chad used as well is participatory, because it really isn't something that you can sit in the office and go, well, it looks to me like, this piece of property is owned by the state, and oh, look, there's a couple farmers over there. I mean, it really is a matter of going in the field and sitting down with those actors and saying, so is this, your activity, and who comes through here, and, what agreements do you have with your neighbors? And I think that is a key part of actually reducing that conflict component, because you've got the actors talking, and so you're not waiting till something happens and then trying to get them to talk. So it's very much, I think, that participatory component is critical early as opposed to late.
Jill did say an awful lot about land rights, but you in your question mentioned the word water, and I really think that's an area we need substantial development. In the United States in the 1850s, we didn't have any water rights, and all of a sudden we had a lot of battles. And we started off with the English system, which is if you can find it, you can have it. And the next thing you know, we had what they call the prior appropriation system, which depending on how long you've been keeping it, you have a more senior water right. How long you've been using it, you have a more senior water right. And it's turned out to be a system that reduced an awful lot of conflict in various parts of the country. Was it Roosevelt that said, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting? I mean, Mark Twain, sorry, I forgot the quote. But establishing some sort of parallel right to water is going to be very important. And in the climate change arena, in most of the subtropics, we expect substantially less rain, and that means, I don't know if you've ever seen that picture from the IPCC. They've now revised it, but it looks about the same. It's just a band about the latitude of Texas. It goes all the way around the world and has substantial implications in Africa, China, parts of Asia, et cetera. I really think that some resolution of the water rights has to go along with this land right. And even in the United States, we're now having big battles about it on the groundwater side. You know, historically, we allocated the surface water, but I work in an area near San Antonio sometimes, and they have a big battle ongoing continually about who gets that water.
Why don't we take these two questions first? Oh, sorry, you already have a microphone in your hand. Let's start in the far right.
Microphone rights. Is this on? Brad Brooks Rubin from the Economic Bureau of the Department of State and I have a question for Jill on the land side. A topic that sort of your paper and your presentation hinted at, sort of, but I was interested in a bit more depth, which is certainly in the work I do, which is focused on extractives and conflict diamonds, conflict minerals. The nature of land-related conflicts can differ greatly depending on the kind of resource that the economic potential of the land. So if there's competition between communities and industrial-sized mining and agriculture, or communities versus artisanal mining, or communities versus agriculture alone, the interventions that I've experienced or read about at some level in terms of how you approach land conflicts differ dramatically based on the economic potential and the resource potential of the land itself. And the Kyrgyzstan and Burma examples you mentioned seem to largely focus on the extractive side, the mining potential of both countries. But I wondered if you could talk more in depth maybe about the differing approaches that might develop in parts of those countries or in other countries where you've seen where the resource potential is not of those kind, but perhaps small-scale artisanal mining with limited economic potential, or purely agricultural, or there's very limited, I would imagine on the mountainous side you would have some areas where there isn't much economic potential, but you're talking mostly about kind of communal security more than anything else. So I don't know if you can address any of that in more depth.
Thank you, Brad. Let's go ahead and take two questions over here, and then the panelists can respond to all three, if that's okay.
Mirza Johani from the Aga Khan Foundation. I liked all your presentations. They were really insightful and thoughtful. And I asked myself, what is the Higher Education Solutions Network for? For solutions for whom is the question that comes to my mind. And I think that I was here for some of it yesterday as well. And I think the more we look at this whole problematic in terms of solutions for us, and for our thinking, the less effective it will be. And the more we think about solutions developed in participation with others, for whom these solutions matter, and for whom these solutions can be applied immediately, irrespective of what we learn from that, the better this initiative will be. And so my hope would be that we would be looking at this wonderful initiative by USAID in terms of being innovative itself in the way it does things, as opposed to just looking at innovations. And I've heard quite a lot this morning, which really helps me think that we are well on the way to that in this particular segment. So thank you very much for that.
Hi, my name is Joe Hewitt from USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. I'm grabbing this microphone with a little bit of trepidation because I don't think I've got my question well thought out. So forgive me, I'm going to muddle through this a little bit. As I was listening to a lot of this stuff on land, and I don't get the opportunity to think a lot about the connections between land and conflict as much as I would like to, because I agree that it's central. It's a central issue in a lot of the places we work in. I guess the question I have in my head, if the focus is on understanding what are the causes of what I call organized violent conflict. So when I talk about organized violent conflict, I'm talking about conflict between organized, mobilized groups of people who are either fighting another organized, mobilized group of people in intercommunal conflict, or I'm talking about an organized insurgency fighting against a government. If that's the kind of conflict we're trying to understand, how can disputes over land connect and feed into that? And I think my answer, and again, remembering that I'm muddling through here, I think my answer is rarely is that going to be the case. Because it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where disputes over land would be the overriding grievance of a group of people that would cause them to mobilize around just that issue and then fight a government or fight another group of people. In other words, what I'm saying is that it seems to me what's much more likely is the kind of conflict that breaks out over land is our small, very small groups of people against other small groups of people, or individuals against other individuals, which was probably very common. So I guess I'll stop there, and I get my point. The reason I'm asking this question is I'm trying to get my head around what is the scope of this problem. What is the type of conflict we're worried about around land? And I'm putting my thoughts out there. I'm happy to be convinced otherwise that my initial conjecture is wrong. But I'd like to get a little bit of discussion around this because I want to try to understand the contours of the problem, whether we should be worried in some circumstances that the problems of land have the potential to create large-scale organized conflict that has a destabilizing dynamic in countries, or whether or not we're focusing on something that has a much more localized conflict dynamic. Thanks.
Thank you. Sure, let's let Tim add, and then we'll come over to the panelists for responses.
Joe, it doesn't, all of us have ill-prepared comments or such, so I'm just going to build up. I wanted to put the Africa slice on the issue of land and resource rights. Rights and Resources Institute has a very nice little graphic of showing devolution of authority, land at the national, community, subnational, and individual privatization. In the case of Africa, Africa is owned by the governments and predominantly, and we're just seeing some small community-based natural resource allocations. And so from my perspective from Africa, the issue is less land rights than it is that bundle of rights that are called resource rights, and whether that's wildlife or fisheries or timber products or mineral rights or water rights. That's what's the controlling factor. And in that instance, we see lots of Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, northern Uganda, conflicts over areas that are resource-based. Biafra would be another historical conflict that was partially national or subnational colonial heritage kinds of problems being regulated, but less over land, but some subset of I guess the Niger river system in Nigeria would be another example of all of the succession movements across the world to the degree that they're spawned by conflict over resources, less over conflict over land.
All right, let's take that large basket of issues and throw it onto the panelists. Who would like to start? Should we start with Chad this time? Sure. Come down the other way.
I guess I'll make an attempt to address the issue Joe raised, which was is something I think that we're questioning. Is this link between smaller scale natural resource-based conflict and larger conflicts involving more organized or maybe an identifiable group? Sometimes, and certainly not always, but the distribution of land rights and the types of land uses is based on some type of identity or organized grouping. And in particular, I'm thinking about the history of Kyrgyz people in Central Asia who were typically the pastoralists and nomadic pastoralists using the uplands, as opposed to the more sedentary Uzbek population who were the agriculturalists. And so that this sort of distribution of land and land uses was in parts based on ethnic divisions. And so that today, when you have smaller scale natural resource-based conflicts, that they are embedded in this larger history, and this complex history of identity and past uses, and so that the kind of potential, I guess it's sort of a hypothesis, is that if you can address these smaller scale issues that may cross these identity boundaries, does that generate the capacity to deal, that empathy, that understanding, to then scale up and maybe deal with those underlying historical, more complex issues? And that in itself is something that's worth investigating and understanding.
Okay. I guess a couple of thoughts. Unfortunately, in a lot of countries, the land system, the management of land resources, is one of the big opportunities for corruption within the government. It's not a newsflash, I know, but that is a source of insecurity from the individual landholder's perspective. What has happened is, if there is insecurity, let's say between ethnic groups over a piece of land, it gives, let's say, a rebel group the opportunity to provide that protection for that land that's void from the official formal government. And it builds a support, perhaps. It builds an opportunity for them to grow because they're providing a security function for that land to these people. And it's not necessarily over a boundary. It's not necessarily about, the fact that this was certain ethnic groups or a different, but the fact that there has been conflict, it creates an opportunity for somebody else to provide that security. And then people have a tendency to gravitate toward whoever's able to ensure that their pastures will be protected or their crops will be secure. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a dispute over a piece of land per se, but it could be the concept of security on land. That's an issue, which can obviously grow to a broader empowerment, if you will, of different forces within a country. To the question about the approaches that are taken with the conflict, depending on the type of possibilities for the land, I think you're absolutely right. To state the obvious, depending on what the value is of a piece of land, whether it's been deemed appropriate for agriculture or they've just located, a new mineral on that property, those activities in themselves, by creating an increased value on that property, can potentially increase the, opportunity for conflict as well. And so, do I have specific examples as to what types of conflict mitigation or approaches for these different kinds of scenarios? I don't have, at my fingertips, but it's certainly something to be aware of as we go in and improve a situation on a piece of land. We want to make sure that one of the unintended consequences is not that we're introducing a different type of conflict because of the increased value or the increased wealth opportunity from that piece of property. And I think there's any number of research opportunities in that regard as to what is most effective, whether it's, like I said, from a large agribusiness perspective or an extraction opportunity. How do we ensure that we're not violating someone else's existing rights, whether it's through use or ownership, and or are we creating a scenario where because of a newfound wealth on that property, that there aren't claims that are coming forward and creating further disruption in the environment?
Let me just say a little bit toward your higher education comment. All the others said land, and so I defer to the experts on that. In the United States, we have a three-part agricultural endeavor. We have a research service, we have a higher education service, and we have an extension service. It's information dissemination. And I think part of the whole climate change adaptation issue involves all three of those, where in terms of adaptation, there's a lot of localized private activity that has to go on and does go on. In the United States, in the last 30 years, we've seen the average area where corn is produced shift north and west by 150 miles. That's been pure private decision-making based on the information that they get just from observing the weather. But in the longer run, in areas, suitability of cropping systems is going to move to higher latitudes and higher elevations and higher latitudes. And we need to both develop information on the likely trends and what may work better, develop information on what kinds of new technologies may be needed and non-traditional practices may be needed to carry some of this out, and disseminate that information. And it obviously can't reside at Texas A&M if it's about an issue in Uzbekistan or somewhere like that. It's got to be localized in some form or fashion. But there's also roles. There's roles for international work. There's roles for localized work, because it's going to be highly unlikely that a small farmer in Uzbekistan is going to be able to develop a new variety that's going to help solve the problem. That may have to come out of the CG system and things like that. And we need a coordinated higher education approach toward doing this, or educational approach, not only higher. I have no idea exactly what's being promised by the Conflict and Development Center, so maybe at some point Ed can stand up and say what he's going to do there. But anyhow.
Could I just build on this? First, Cynthia? Yeah. I guess kind of coming back to this term, knowledge dissemination, and which absolutely is critical in many ways, especially if you're talking about scaling up new innovations or new crop varieties or whatever it may be. But I also want to add to that, which is what I was trying to get at in my talk about participatory knowledge generation. And yeah, that happens at smaller scales, but the emphasis on participatory knowledge generation is this idea that the end user of research is more likely to the potential end user of research is more likely to actually use it if they're part of the process of generating it, and also adding that particular type of knowledge that cannot be found in experimental plots off-site. And so it's a kind of a combination of both. It's not discounting one, but it's also kind of adding this much more localized, contextualized element to the learning. And actually, specifically with climate change, I'm thinking about a climate change adaptation program in Kyrgyzstan now. It's actually the Aga Khan Foundation is running, where they're doing their best to kind of identify and scale down some of the regional models on climate change to understand the potential effects and impacts in particular valleys, in particular villages, and drawing on what remains of the hydrometeorological data from a lot of it from Soviet era and the little bit that continues today. But the third part of that triangle, the triangulation of information that they're looking at is local observations of climate trends and impacts, and some of the ways that people are already adapting to some of these changes. And in particular, I mean, what was quite surprising for them in their program was that winds, high winds and the increasing rate of high winds has been a major impact on people. And so, minor innovations, like people are stacking their hay lower. I mean, that's a kind of a simple thing, but people have already been adapting, and that we were learning about that adaptation and then helping to support that, or they were supporting that adaptation.
Thank you. Okay, there were many people wanting to grab the floor. So, and then Takora, would you like to say something?
Paul Summers from California State University, Fresno. Jill, you talked about the role of the private sector, skin in the game, profit motive. I'm wondering if the solution network should look at how the companies that are maybe big mining, big oil, big energy, big ag, how do they deal with conflict in the areas where they're conducting their business? They have to do this to keep the enterprise going. I'm sure there's lots of lessons or information that we can gather from them, both positive and perhaps some negative things. But they're in it for profit, so they've got to get it right. They've got to figure out a way to mitigate conflicts between rival groups. I know some years ago I did some work in Papua New Guinea, which every week they were discovering a gold mine or oil or something, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, or putting up a new cell tower or something, and there was constant conflict. So, again, I think maybe.
Yeah, I would agree. I think you'll find the private sector is receptive to that. They're looking for opportunities, obviously, to grow business, but they're also looking to leverage a knowledge base that's out there. Indeed, they have their own, as you've pointed out. I can't speak for ExxonMobil, but I can tell you that in conversations with people at ExxonMobil, or wherever, they're certainly game to become a stakeholder in a bigger process. So, and I can certainly speak for Stewart. And, we have attempted PPP scenarios in different locations and have gotten fairly far down the road, only to be squashed at the end from some political agenda perspectives. But it is possible, and there is interest from the governments that we're working with to come up with a different strategy that takes them beyond, a flash, if you will, a moment of activity, and how do we grow that and sustain that investment that takes place, whether it's from the aid community or it's, from, other donor environments, or, ultimately it's how do we improve that business transaction environment within the country, whether it's buying and selling land from a basic level, or it's allocating concessions for resources, and it's ultimately an overall business strategy for that country. And I think it brings a very interesting dynamic if you can, meld together the university environment with the donor environment with the private sector. I think it's a very powerful dynamic, and I think you'd be pleased with the receptive nature that you would get, in that regard.
They're already on the ground
Yeah.
out there, and they have a vested interest, and they're also, along with the communities, it's a value chain. So they're
Right.
trying to all figure out how to make this thing work, and it can be a source of conflict, but it can also be a way to perhaps mitigate it so that everybody hopefully wins.
Well, exactly. And given the experience, let's say from a USAID perspective, where they've spent, years and years looking at conflict resolution approaches and what works to incorporate that into an overall business strategy for a country, I think is very powerful. But again, I think, the key is everybody's got to have some skin in the game. We don't want anybody else buying somebody else's bus tickets, as my boss always says. So, how do we leverage that? Obviously these businesses are there to make money, but that's not to say that there's not benefit that can't be derived from a public-private partnership approach for everybody, most especially, of course, the country that we're targeting. So.
Just taking my quick prerogative as a moderator. For those of you who might not be familiar with it as a resource, International Alert has developed guidance called Conflict-Sensitive Business Practice, which pertains exactly to this subject. And it's a really great resource which is meant to help guide and advise the private sector in these kind of engagements, but also captures the lessons learned from those engagements in the past around the world. It's a great resource. Conflict-Sensitive Business Practice. And it's produced by International Alert, which is a UK-based NGO. Takora?
It's really gratifying to hear the comments around this table about how the Higher Education Solutions Network might be able to leverage a variety of communities. That's essentially what we are trying to do from a programmatic level as we put together both kind of the supply side and the demand side. So on the supply side, you have a lot of universities, academic institutions, and others who are creating new technologies and approaches. They're testing them, they're scaling them, they're working on new methodologies, and we want to be able to amplify the work that they do to a much broader community. And so your participation in this conversation is a way to help us bring a lot of different actors and stakeholders to the table as we are developing this, as we are growing it. Because the way that we as an agency have worked with the academic community for an extended period of time is in a couple of different very critical ways that we continue to work. Human and institutional capacity development, which we talked about yesterday, very specific sector research, which the CG centers, they address some of that, the collaborative research support programs that are focused on food security through the Bureau for Food Security focus there, implementation of programs, and then kind of impact evaluation. But each of those things is very disparate, and we haven't really had the opportunity to bring all of those conversations together, and that's one of the things that we are attempting to do with the network. So, developing solutions with and in cooperation and participation, some of our partners, MIT, for example, is one of those that's working on creative capacity development in rural context. So it's not just, here's the solution. That's great. It's how do you empower people to think about problem solving and designing solutions for themselves as well. Our program with Makerere University in Uganda is focused on building resilience in sub-Saharan Africa. It's going to be reaching out to a variety of communities through their universities to build, and it will still be building capacity, but it is this notion of solutions that are generated in partnership, in context, that we can then disseminate and spread widely, as well as scale, and thinking about methodologies for scale, because scale doesn't just happen automatically. There has to be a lot that goes into that conversation. So one of our partners, Duke University, is focused on global health technologies and approaches and scaling them, but they're working with Investor Circle, which is an investment firm that is really focused on kind of developing world types of things. So, the partners that they've brought together is a cohort of for-profit and not-for-profit ventures in the developing world, and a couple that are based in the U.S. focused on global health technology. So ultimately, we want to be able to really empower solutions that are global, solutions that are local, but thinking broadly about that context is what we are attempting to get at. And so it's gratifying to hear that all of you think that's a great idea. Awesome.
So do we have other questions or comments? Ed?
If no one else, I will. Yes. I wanted to respond to a couple of things. Tim Resch, starting out, identified some other areas of natural resources, and I probably should have said that to begin with, that of course it's not possible with 3 panelists or 6 panelists to cover all the many areas. And I really want to regard our audience and all participants as resources for the discussion of any wider set of issues that they'd like to bring up. For example, I just want to use this opportunity to say that we're missing one man who was on his way here from Indonesia with a paper on minerals and mineral extraction. His wife became quite ill, and she's in intensive care in Prague right now, and so they weren't able to make it. But minerals is a part of the discussion, forestry, fisheries, and one of the areas that I've often felt that would be really good to discuss is genetic resources. It's not, I don't know that genetic resources have come to the point of inciting conflict, but it's certainly an issue within countries. Not 2 years ago in India, MS Swaminathan Institute convened a conference on traditional rights to genetic materials from their environment. And the intent of the workshop was to reach an accord among communities and the government of India on how people, a wide group of participants, could exploit biological resources in these communities. Exploit them for good purposes, for medicine, nutrition, or whatever. And in the end, we couldn't reach a conclusion because the community leadership had become so resistant to any outside authority coming into the communities and acquiring genetic materials that they wanted, that they prevented there from being an accord. But biodiversity more broadly is an area that I think that we can look at. We're right now working in the DR Congo, in the Virunga National Park, to provide greater security for natural resources, which can be a source of income. So there's a wide range of opportunities to discuss forestry, fisheries, minerals, biodiversity, water, and land. But I think they all, and other areas, belong in this discussion. The other one, just to briefly respond to Joe's question about do land disputes ever lead to major wars or organized forces? And I'll just give a little bit of anecdotal information, but I think a lot of research could be done in that area. One time in Iraq, a former presidential contender had a private conversation with me in which he said, Ed, the fundamental issue in Iraq today is land rights and land. And if you look back at the history of the ethnic divisions in Iraq, there's a very close association between attempted land reforms and what didn't happen, as well as what did happen to the various minorities there, and majorities. And there's a land component and a notion of decrees that tried to provide for land reform that didn't work, that underlies a lot of, is a part of it. And then there's the question of displaced persons. Jill and I were looking at land in northern Ghana, and village after village, we talked to headmen and farmers, and all of them said, oh, we're not worried about our land rights. We've always had land, there's enough land, we've not even worried about anyone's boundaries. But elsewhere in Ghana today, you see very rapid land going into developments, to large-scale farming and so on. And it's only a matter of a short period of time till those farmers will come under pressure. And they happen to be a minority that has moved into that area, into northern Ghana, in recent decades. So persons displaced from those lands, I can't help but feel could be a source of conflict in the future. The other thing I just briefly read this morning before coming to this, the history of range wars in the U.S. And those were armed insurrections over land and water. And it really took the imposition of a strong imposition of government and state security agencies to bring those about. Now, for tomorrow, we can talk about how technology had a role in that as well, such as preventing livestock disease and barbed wire. So that's for tomorrow.
Thank you. Tim, would you like last comment from the floor, and we'll wrap it up?
On that, I'm going to throw another iron in the fire, is illegal wildlife trade, and associated perhaps with that is the illegal trade in drugs and the illegal trade in arms. And in the illegal trade of wildlife trade, there's three different levels. One is ivory, rhino horn, and tiger parts, which are high-value products where the source countries are different from the consumer countries. The other part of the illegal wildlife trade are the turtles and pangolins and snakes and such, which also, as well as local bushmeat, the illegal wildlife trade at the bushmeat subsistence level, as well as cross-border urban demands for wild game in many parts of at least Africa, and so that's another important conflict area. It's substantially destabilizing, corrupting people. and it has a significant impact on development. The illegal arms trade, which, to the degree that it supports conflict and/or provide, let's see, it's one thing to deal with conflict with spears and machetes, and it's another thing to deal with conflict with AK-47s. And so the illegal arms trade, and then finally the illegal drug trade, particularly cocaine and heroin, are again a source country, consumer country conflict that clearly destabilizes governments as well as causes societal harm in the consumer countries. So I would also like to offer up for A&M consideration the illegal trade on high-value commodities where source and consumer differ.
Chad, would you like to respond?
Well, not to that. I actually just wanted to acknowledge and appreciate Takora's comment about balancing really the supply side and the demand side for research. I work with University of Central Asia, which is part of the larger Aga Khan Development Network, and spend much of my time, I wish more of my time, working directly with researchers from the region, mentoring where I have capacity. We deal with a variety of topics, but also trying to facilitate these arrangements because between our researchers, the communities for whom we're trying to serve with our research, and the vast wealth of experience and expertise of researchers from universities abroad, especially in the United States, and so it's trying to balance all of these different interests and kind of aligning these the particular expertise and the particular value that each of these groups, the international researcher from abroad, the local researcher in-house, and ultimately the communities we're trying to make this research useful for, is just a delicate balancing act. And so I'm just happy to hear that there is an acknowledgement that this process, how you go about doing this, and Mirza mentioned this a little earlier, is just as important, if not more important, than what the particular issues are that we're going to focus on.
Thank you. Here's the last comment. Sure, why not?
My name, I thought I should say one other thing that was on my mind. I was probably just telling me not to do my other work when to pay more attention. But the other thing that goes to my mind is that when we talk about conflict and development, almost inherently we're talking about fragile states. There are conflicts happening in strong states, but by and large, in the developing business, they happen to be fragile states. So when I hear things like dissemination of knowledge and policy development and sustainability and advocacy and all of that, I think to myself, of all my time that I've spent in fragile states, it's been extremely difficult to move forward on that. So yet again, a plea to think when we are talking about solutions, the more localized they are, the more adaptive they are right there where they're needed, is so important, because as those states get stronger, those groups, those community-based groups, those local groups will begin to shape and form their own policies if they're empowered through the work that we do with them.
Thank you. I think we will conclude this session. So I'll just try to provide a bit of pulling together of what we've heard, but I want to thank Mirza for that last comment, because you happen to be surrounded by people from CMM, and you didn't see them, but they were nodding vigorously at what you were saying. As you may or may not know, more than half of the foreign assistance provided by the United States government is given to conflict-affected and fragile states. So whether we're working on land tenure and property rights or climate change or even other kinds of community development programming, it is more often than not happening in the context that you just raised, which is part of why this kind of research partnership will have so much process side benefit for USAID in general. So we managed to do a fairly good job of getting a lot of different resources and assets mentioned and on the table. I feel like we in the first session had an easier job. The respondents panel will probably expand that list further, but maybe has a tougher job of beginning to focus towards the afternoon session when Texas A&M will try to choose 1 or 2 research questions. Just as a reminder, we did cover climate change, land tenure and property rights, participatory environmental governance issues in general, extractive industries, slightly touched on water, and then a number of other assets which were helpfully mentioned at the end, and issues around the illegal trafficking of wildlife and their other biodiversity kinds of issues. So out of the presentations this morning and then the discussion, I sort of heard some common themes arising that I thought might be useful to help frame how Texas A&M will think about what range of issues you want to bring into whatever that central research project would be. And the first was that resource management is clearly a source of conflict in many places where it is not done well, but that it is definitely, it represents a strong opportunity for doing peace-building work or actually doing conflict resolution through the resource management process itself. Adaptive capacity as a term was mentioned a couple of times, and I think at least all of the presenters sort of highlighted it as key in their sectors or fields, but also as central to the notion of resilience in general and how you build out from there. So I think the tougher questions then become adaptive capacity of which groups, which institutions, why, adaptive capacity to what, for what. Those are really central to USAID's research agenda in general in any number of sectors at the moment. There was certainly a strong focus on Central Asia and Kyrgyzstan in particular based on the presenters. That might give us a jumping off point again for a place to focus research. And there was also a lot of attention to the importance of including various levels of actors. I think Jill's presentation of access rights and user rights and sort of the range of rights that are connected with land are a good way to think about all those different levels of actors that through a development intervention we need to be cognizant of. And again, when working in a fragile state or a conflict-affected context, those issues sometimes become extremely politicized or even more complicated than just managing the technical intervention to fix the problem would otherwise be. And that, as you pointed out, is extremely complicated on its own under the best of circumstances. And the last, picking up on a term that Chad used, was cumulative stress. I thought that was really relevant for these 3 areas that we discussed on the panel as well. The cumulative stress and the capacity of institutions or actors to respond to those stresses, which may be connected with shocks or triggering events, but really when we're talking about environment and natural resource management questions, it is often a question of the cumulative stress over time and how those things are then caught up in a particular event or a shock to this system. So I think we have a lot of interesting information to move forward from, and the respondents hopefully have a lot to respond to on the next panel. And we will first take a break and invite everyone to have coffee and other refreshments for, I believe, 15 minutes. Is that right, Ed?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. So coming back at 10:55 or 11? At 11. So if everyone could be back in your seats at 11, we will then continue with the next panel, including the respondents. Thank you for your presentations this morning.